All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming in today personally and virtually as well. Got quite a few things on the agenda for today. And we're going to start with a call to order. And Ann, do you want me to? Okay. Okay, we'll start with the call to order.
Thank you, ma'am. So I'll call the roll. Reed Williams.
Here.
Dr. Cantu. Here. John Agather.
Here.
Anacua Garcia.
Here.
Councilwoman Viagran. Peter Ononthre. Andy Castillo.
Here.
Al Rodriguez. Michael Kinnick. Anne Marie. Jack Hebden, I believe he's out of town.
Here.
Oh, you're here. There you go. Wayne Eddington. Anthony Edwards. Michael Sanchez. Didi Belmaris.
Here.
Kurt Anastasia. Christopher Fulton. I see, Christopher, I see your name, but I don't hear you. Dr. Femi? Dana McGinnis? Jim Berg? Jim's out of town as well. And Anita Ledbetter.
Hi, everybody, I'm here.
All right, we have a quorum.
We have a quorum. All right. Next order of business is the invocation, and that is Chad Hoopingardner. You got a mic?
Thank you. Please join me in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the many blessings you've freely given to each of us, and we thank you for the opportunity to serve this community each and every day. We ask for your presence to guide this meeting of the Rate Advisory Committee. Provide them with the knowledge, compassion, and wise counsel necessary as they discuss the business matters on the agenda today. Help us all to remember that we are students acting on behalf of our customers, stewards acting on behalf of our customers, and provide us with the grace to serve all people well. We ask this in your name, amen.
Thank you. All right, next on the item is public input. Do we have any public input for today? We do not. All right. Then the next item on the agenda is just a quick announcement. And I'm going to read something that Dr. Romero and the Board of Trustees wants us to be aware of. Starting with the CPS Energy July Board, each month a summary report will be provided to the CPS Energy Board of Trustees outlining the RAC presentation and listing any action items that resulted from the meeting. In addition, starting in August, Dr. Romero will be adding the objectives to our agenda to ensure that the RAC is in sync with what the board objectives are. So I just wanted to make that announcement. And are there any questions or comments from that? And I think we're also looking at the chat box. So, and speaking of which, just to make the announcement that we're going to make the chat box open so that we can all see any questions that might be put in there. If anybody in the chat box wants to talk to, or at least send it to a person rather than everyone, just be sure to change that on the chat box and it won't come up on the screen. Okay, so no other comments. I am now going to turn it over to Mr. John Kossip, who will do an introduction of the consultant, Charles River Association.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cantu. And I got 3 level set slides. We'll flash up here real quick before I introduce the next speaker, Charles River Associates. Our timeline, a simplified version of it. kind of shows the ground we've covered so far since September of last year. And you see the star in the center there. We are here in that scenario analysis approach, assumption stage, and community conversations, and rapidly going to be moving into the analysis results and option stage next, and ultimately shooting for the recommendation on a plan by December. Next slide.
John, I may interrupt you for a moment. Adrian, can you please mute everybody online? Thank you.
All right. Give it a minute or two to try to sort out the audio. Will this advance the slides?
It should.
Okay.
Adrian, it sounds like somebody's driving, and so we're getting a lot of interference in the room. Much better, thank you.
All right, we got it working now. All right, you just got to turn on the on button. All right, next slide. Just a little refresher here, a little recap on the two generation planning contracts, or two consultants, kind of two key consultants that we're using for generation planning support. Of course, Charles River Associates is here today and will present next. They're the modeling and analysis services and an extension of the CPS Energy generation planning staff. The second company, that's the next item on the agenda. There'll be some activities to narrow down the advisor for the RAC. Again, that's to support the RAC to conduct a review of the overall process for the generation plan update. And that's all we got there. So next, just going to show you where this fits into the overall process. We showed this many, many months ago, back in September. And last meeting, we covered that first box, 25-year usage forecast, with electric load forecast. Covered that, a lot of things about assumptions, weather-related information, et cetera. And the next two boxes are really where we're going to focus today: the resource and capital plan, the various portfolios that we're thinking about here, the production cost modeling, simulating those portfolios and how they would run in our system, and the associated economics that would then flow into the financial forecast, the company-wide impacts of a generation plan update. And so the financial piece, you'll hear more about that later in some later meetings. But that's all we got there. Just want to kind of focus your attention. Two individuals we have from Charles River Associates, very experienced individuals in integrated resource planning. Pat Augustine is a vice president in CRA, or Charles River Associates energy practice. Many years experience.
Hello?
Hey, hello, is somebody trying to ask a question? Okay, just want to make sure everybody's on mute. All right, so Pat has worked with dozens of utilities for integrated resource planning support and market forecasting activities. We also have with us tonight Suk Warren, an associate principal for Charles River Associates. Again, many years of experience, modeling experience, decarbonization modeling, working with utilities on electric integrated resource planning and strategies for both gas and electric. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Pat Augustine. All right, if we can bring up the next presentation. Is that a separate slide, a separate file? Yeah. Okay. There we go.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you to the RAC committee here for having us, and good afternoon to everyone here and on the phone. Today we want to spend about 45 minutes in the agenda here to talk through CRA and our background very briefly, and then provide an overview to the group on the resource planning process that we will plan to undertake over the next few months here in concert with CPS Energy staff, as John just outlined. Trying to advance here. Thank you. So just in terms of the agenda, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes introducing myself, my colleague Knight, and CRA in general to give some background on our experience in this space. We've got a brief executive summary where we're going to hit the high points, give a real high-level overview of three key areas in the process, and allow you to see from a high level what this process from a modeling and analysis perspective looks like. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into each of those areas through the remainder of the agenda. So that will incorporate a review of planning objectives, a review of ERCOT market perspectives, and then a preview on some of the portfolio concepts that we're planning to analyze and build out for the CPS Energy portfolio. So that's the agenda. We welcome any clarifying questions or any questions as I walk through it, and we have plenty of time, I know, in the broader agenda here for discussion afterwards. So very briefly, before we get into the content here, wanted to provide an introduction of CRA and our experience in general. Over the last 5 years or so, we've supported utilities across half the states in the United States in various resource planning activities. That includes Texas, that includes regions across the country from west to east. And generally, our work spans the gamut of various different service offerings that we provide to electric utilities, investors, developers, and others across the power industry. This slide here provides a quick overview of those types of capabilities and services that we provide our clients. It includes modeling and analysis, technical advisory support, stakeholder engagement, expert witness testimony, all related to what we characterize here as integrated resource planning and associated input development, output analysis, technical advisory for the clients that we work with, and participating in forums like this, where we communicate information to public stakeholder advisory groups, boards, and we also sponsor testimony and provide expert witness support to our clients in support of the activities that I just outlined. So a couple examples at the bottom. Don't want to go through the full list of clients that we've worked with, but to give you a sense of the type of clients that we've worked with in a very similar setting, we've got a few of those examples on the bottom. Generally, we do a lot of stakeholder management, analysis of resource planning and market perspectives, and then we take that to provide advisory support to our clients. In some cases, like this one, we work with our clients who have internal modeling teams and provide a partnership. In others, we're doing all the analysis, and in others, we're providing facilitation or expert witness support. So with that as a brief introduction, let's dive into more of the heart of today's content. And today's discussion is largely going to provide an overview of the overall integrated resource planning process and approach that we're deploying here. And there's going to be quite a bit of initial content on planning objectives, market perspectives, and CPS portfolio options. So there's a lot of terminology here that we'll try to get into a little bit more detail here on and level set on all the inputs and the outputs that will be part of this process. But before we do the detail, the next couple slides here are really meant to provide an executive summary of that. So the next 3 or 4 slides can almost be seen as a bit of a cheat sheet on what the process looks like and how we plan to go forward. So we'll start here with an overall view on what we characterize as our 5-step resource planning process. And today we'll largely be focusing on the first two steps. We're going to spend a little bit of time also on that third middle step, but the focus of the presentation is on identifying planning objectives and developing market perspectives. So very briefly on all of these, the first step is quite critical to any planning process in our mind. And we'll spend a little bit more time as we go through the session here today explaining what that means. And essentially identifying the planning objectives and the associated metrics means that up front you want to get a sense of what you're shooting for, what the goals of the process are, and how you're going to measure against those goals. And we welcome input and discussion on those topics as we get further on. But that's important to do up front. So you set those objectives and metrics before you do the analysis. So you're not doing analysis and then figuring out what to present, or having the suggestion that you're only going to present certain things that come out of the analysis, but get consensus up front on what we're focused on, what matters to the company, what matters to the city, and how we're going to measure those objectives. The second step here is developing market perspectives. And the term that we generally use here is scenarios. And we'll probably come back to this several times because the terminology may be different in terms of how people think about things. But from our perspective and in this process, scenarios are external drivers, things that are not exactly within CPS Energy's control. So what the price of natural gas might be in the future, whether there's a carbon policy at the federal level, whether there are tax credits available for certain technologies, how technology change evolves over time, and what the cost of different technologies might be in the future. These are market perspectives, how the ERCOT market will evolve, what power prices might look like. And it's very important to develop perspectives on what these scenario drivers look like. And later on today, we're going to get into a little bit of detail on what we're proposing and the types of variables and the types of themes that we'll look at. And there's also some other uncertainty evaluation techniques that we'll be talking about. So that's key to get a framework on what the market that you're operating in looks like and how you can quantify it, parameterize it, and use that in the analysis. Step 3, which we'll introduce a little bit today, but not get into too much detail, is what we call portfolios. These are things that CPS Energy, or the utility in question, has more control over. So it's, from a terminology perspective, it's different from scenario, but it's a portfolio set of strategic resource options that the utility can pursue. That can be decisions about retirement dates of existing units. It can be decisions about the type of resources to add to the mix over time: gas, wind, solar, storage, new technology, demand-side resources. So we'll talk a little bit today about how we think about designing those options, what those options might look like, and again, we'll be soliciting input and ideas or comments on that topic. And then steps 4 and 5 are really combining all those setup steps and performing portfolio modeling and analysis, and ultimately recording metrics and outputs that we can tie back to step 1 and score and report and provide a ranking of how different portfolio options might do across the scenarios against those objectives. So with that as an overview, we'll spend the next 3 slides doing a quick hit on each of those first three steps, and then the remainder of the presentation we'll get into a little bit more detail, particularly on the first 2. So determining planning objectives, which is step 1 here. We will get into a little bit more detail shortly and flesh this out a little bit, but as a very high-level introduction to this key first step, it's really all about identifying objectives and then identifying metrics, how you can measure yourself against those objectives. And ultimately, the goal here is to evaluate the different options or those portfolios to facilitate decision-making. So if you don't have a clear framework on how you're going to rank or measure or evaluate the different plans or strategies that we're looking at, it makes it difficult to come to consensus or even to look at the trade-offs that exist. So the first three on the left-hand side here are examples of planning objectives that we're aware of and in consultation with CPS Energy know are certainly priorities. Those include system reliability and resiliency, include affordability for customers, it includes environmental sustainability. So things that are core to the mission of the utility or core to the goals that a utility sets in terms of serving its customers over the short, medium, and long term. On the right-hand side, we've got some other examples. These are other objectives that we've found are used by utilities across the country and across the industry. It could include financial stability metrics, particularly for a municipal utility. Some of those may be related to affordability. Some of those might be a little bit different, and you might want to measure them differently and see how different resource strategies and portfolios play out against them. You may look at system flexibility in different ways. Could be optionality to pivot over time. It could be flexibility operationally in the market. So there may be different ways to measure that. There could be local economic or workforce impacts that are of interest. And that could entail what the impacts of retiring a plant are, what the impacts of building new capacity of different types might be. And that could impact workforce directly for CPS Energy. It could impact the local community and the surrounding communities. So those are examples. As we go through the remainder of the presentation, we'll spend a little bit more time fleshing out how we can measure some of those examples. And like I said, I know the CPS team is interested in making sure that the RAC input and comments on these are received at this point in time and over the subsequent weeks, so we can get this scorecard type concept settled up front, or at least have a good guidance on what we want to look for, what we want to measure before doing the analysis. So step 2 was developing market perspectives, and here's a quick hit on what this looks like. And again, later in the presentation, we'll go a level deeper and flesh this out a little bit more. But the key reminder here is that market perspectives or scenarios or other measures of uncertainty, could be extreme weather event, could be stochastic risk, random risk in the market, are ways to evaluate the system and ensure that the different portfolio options that we look at are robust to uncertainty, are robust to lots of different conditions that could happen in the market. And again, these are external drivers, things that you want to look at to assess risk. And these are not items that CPS Energy can control directly, but are external factors that you must operate within. So the drivers that we're talking about are really on the right-hand side. I mentioned them briefly before, things like commodity prices for fuel, for power, carbon policy, and other regulatory regimes that may exist at the federal, state, or ERCOT market level. Market design issues are tied to that. Technology costs, technology tax credits, and demand growth. Some of this can somewhat be influenced by certain actions that the utility takes, but for the most part, these are external drivers. And we often will set a baseline set of conditions for these drivers and have a framework under which to operate the portfolio simulations. But we want to look at risk and uncertainty across them. So what we'll go through a little later is a proposal for 4 distinct scenario themes. These are not final by any means, but they're a way to look at different divergent future states of the world, and we can parameterize them through different combinations of all those variables on the right. So very briefly, they could involve different views on environmental regulations, either stricter or less stringent, different views on where natural gas prices will go, different views on technology costs, different views on load growth, and generally from an integrated state of the world scenario perspective. There's an infinite amount of combinations that you could probably come up with for these drivers, but the goal in any market perspective or scenario development process is to try to identify internally consistent storylines and scenarios that make sense, that are plausible, but distinct from each other. And we'll spend time a little bit later fleshing that out a little bit. And again, we are very open to input or comments on how we're thinking about these scenarios, and if there are other big ticket items that we might be missing. The goal, as I said, is to bracket things, set some benchmarks or ranges that we can look at and push the envelope in different directions. So there may be other ideas that fall very similar to these type of scenarios, but we want to make sure we're getting distinct ranges on the bookends for evaluation. And then finally, step 3, recall, was the development of CPS Energy portfolios. So again, just as a reminder, we're using the term scenarios for external factors. We're using the term portfolios for CPS Energy strategies that can be deployed around specific resource decisions. So as I mentioned, this will incorporate retirements. We've got a couple of the near-term retirement expectations listed on the bottom of the slide. And then it will incorporate new resource strategies or portfolio options that CPS Energy can take to meet its future needs based on likely retirements, based on future load growth that we expect over time. And ultimately, we've got a few themes that we've laid out here, but there's others that we expect from community input to evaluate across those scenarios, across those factors of uncertainty, mapping back to the objectives. So I think John in the past has provided these themes to the group here. There's likely to be a view that's dominated by renewable additions, one that may be dominated by natural gas additions, one that might be blended, an economic blend of different resource types. And there could be permutations off of those that have different retirement dates for some of the existing units. We may assess, as we note in one of the footnotes there, different impacts of energy efficiency programs. So again, there's an infinite universe of options that we can look at, but through this process, we want to establish a targeted list of CPS Energy portfolios that we can evaluate, that we can specify, that are meaningfully different from each other, and then that we can assess against those external drivers. So that's the executive summary, quick rundown of the 3 major steps that we'll be talking about today. Hopefully those 3 or 4 slides can kind of be reference material that you point back to. Oh, there's a question. So let me see if I can read that out. Are you including predictive weather data into the load growth scenarios? And if so, what model are you using? I ask because we need to design for more and hotter days, extreme heat, and how that impacts market perspective and demand growth. So yeah, that's a good question. We've got a couple layers there. One is how the ERCOT market is evolving, and secondly is how the CPS Energy load growth forecast evolves. We're working directly with the CPS Energy load forecasting team. And as part of that analysis, there's a weather normalization process, and there's also an ability to flex the demand growth over time across those perspectives. So one of the uncertainties in demand growth is certainly related to the question here, extreme heat. Others could be related to economic growth, could be related to the relationship between market prices and demand, so the elasticity of demand. Others could be related to the penetration of distributed energy resources. So I think the short answer is yes, we're contemplating this in the scenario projective scenario planning perspectives that we're looking at. To answer the question a little bit more directly, I think one way to get at extreme heat events is not only in this long-term scenario construct, but something that we're contemplating stress testing some of these portfolios against specific events like that. So whether it's an example of the heat wave that we're experiencing now, whether it's an example of, well, if we envision 20 years from now, climate change has resulted in higher than normal temperatures, we can use that data to come up with a sample of load growth perspectives. So in short, I think we're definitely taking that into account. There will be multiple drivers of demand growth uncertainty over the long term. And from an extreme weather perspective, it's definitely on our radar of something that we want to stress test these cases with, whether it's extreme heat or extreme cold conditions that can't always be specified in these long-term scenario uncertainties, but it's one of the stress tests that I think is definitely going to be part of this analysis. Okay, thanks for that question. Don't see any more, so let's move into the next section here, which is a little bit of a deeper dive into the step one process that we outlined, which is determining planning objectives for our scorecard. And the next slide here provides a recap of what we just introduced earlier. And I'll spend a little bit of time first on that box over to the right. One of the things that we've found in our experience doing resource planning is that you have to identify planning objectives that are effective upfront. And some of the characteristics that we think are necessary are that these objectives be discrete, measurable, specific, collectively exhaustive, balanced, and reflects the reality of the specific utility situation that you're dealing with. So what do we mean by that? We don't want objectives that are overlapping with each other and really measuring the same thing. We don't want objectives that are not measurable at all, meaning something aspirational that sounds good, but you can't really measure it. We don't want things that are vague or not specific enough to understand, but we want to be complete. So this is an area where we welcome input to make sure that we're covering the right objectives. But from a preliminary perspective, as I mentioned before, we're definitely interested in reliability, affordability, sustainability, and we think that there are some other categories that may be of interest to the group and to CPS Energy in general, including financial stability, flexibility, and workforce impact. So from a high level, those objectives can really set the stage for what goals that we're looking to achieve. And then when we dive a layer deeper on the next slide, we need to talk about metrics and how we're going to measure that. So this slide is an example of how we translate some of those key objectives into metrics and things that can be measured. This is only a set of examples. Nothing has been finalized, although directionally this is where the team is going. So it's essentially taking those objectives and thinking about how we can quantify them, how we can measure them, and what those measurements might be. So for example, system reliability and resiliency. It's important to measure what we're characterizing here as capacity headroom. How much capacity at a capacity accredited basis do you have in your system relative to your expected peak demand? And that can be measured fairly straightforwardly in a reserve margin. We may also be interested in measures of diversity or perhaps flexibility in resources from an operational perspective. That might provide resiliency and reliability to the system. So the way to measure that may be looking at a pie chart or a simple report on the percentage of resources in the portfolio from a capacity or an energy perspective. We may measure the megawatts of flexible capacity, for example. We don't want to have too many measures, but we want to hit the high points that are important to that objective. Second set of examples are affordability. So obviously residential bill impact is a key metric that is looked at historically by CPS and is very common across the industry. That can be measured by incremental changes in expected monthly bills under the different portfolio options that we'll be evaluating. And that can be measured at different points in time. There could be a near-term view. There could be a long-term 20 or 30-year type net present value view. That could also be measured and likely will be measured across the different scenarios and risk metrics that we just referenced, including the questioner's comment. So something like that can have a lot of different ways of measuring, but ultimately we want to find the key ones that are of most importance to prioritize when we put together the scorecard that will summarize these objectives and metrics. Third example here, environmental sustainability. We know that there are City of San Antonio Climate Action and Adaptation Plan goals, and the ways to measure that are fairly straightforward. We can look at CO2 emissions at various points in time and measure what we expect the portfolio's emissions to be, or the different portfolio options emissions to be, under the different scenarios over time. There may be other emissions that are relevant. Generally speaking, we've seen CO2 be of most importance, but there could be an interest in measuring NOx or SO2 emissions as well at various points in time. So those are some examples, and ultimately, the idea is to take all of those objectives and metrics and put them onto what we call a scorecard. And the way to summarize those metrics is in the scorecard is to provide a list of each of the portfolio options that we're looking at and a quantitative summary of how all of those metrics come out at the end of the day. Again, this is illustrative. This takes those examples from the prior slide and provides a view of how they might look like on a table. A question?
Just a real quick question. On the other three examples you gave of planning objectives, can you just give us a better idea of what system flexibility is in this case? That's, of the six, that one's not as clear in my mind as I'd like it to be.
Sure. I think there are a couple different ways to think about system flexibility. One that we've, or two, I should say, that we've looked at recently are something that we call optionality and something that we call operational flexibility. There could be other ways to think about it, but I think the optionality in resource decisions means how flexible are you to potential market changes over time. So let's say 5, 10 years from now, we have a very different carbon policy at the federal level than we do now, or we have a breakthrough in technology change. Is the portfolio going to be positioned to be responsive to that? And how do you measure that? It could be the duration of the commitments that you have in the portfolio. So have you locked your whole portfolio into a bunch of 30-year assets that would not be able to flexibly move or adapt? Or maybe you have some shorter duration PPAs, or you haven't made decisions on the whole fleet and you're waiting for some other changes to play out. So that's one way we've measured it, to kind of look at your optionality in the resource base. Another might be more operationally. The markets are evolving, as you know, and we're getting more and more intermittent resources in the system. There's likely to be more volatility in the system, and there could be different ways to measure how flexible the portfolio is to respond to those operational changes. Without getting too deep, you can often look at the megawatts in the system that are fast ramping. How many megawatts can respond on call within a 30-minute period or an hour period. So that's one way to proxy that system flexibility from an operational perspective. So if you have all renewables that don't have that ramping capability, or maybe you have all nuclear or all old coal units that don't have that ramping capability, you might score poorly on that type of objective versus certain fast ramping thermal or storage resources that could provide that. So those are a couple examples, probably the ones that I've seen used most recently. And again, some of those might be priorities. Some of them you might like to measure, but maybe not be on the final scorecard. Yeah, thanks. A comment from Anita. One of the important aspects of our climate plan and the adaptation piece, alongside equity and emission reductions, perhaps you can expand that piece of the meeting of meeting the climate plan objective beyond just emission reductions. Yeah, thank you. So that is a good comment that we'll take into account. So I think directly what Anita is referencing is maybe in the environmental sustainability metrics, we're not solely focused on CO2 emissions, but there could be a way to look at equity or environmental justice questions. I think the challenge becomes how to measure that.
And I was, and I'm sorry for the typo, everyone. I was also really kind of trying to home in on the adaptation piece.
Got it. So I guess from an adaptation perspective, some of that may be related to the generation plan. Some of it may be slightly ancillary to it. So I think that is certainly relevant from a metric perspective. Would be interested if you have any ideas on how to measure progress towards adaptation. We could take that offline into the comment period, but I think it's a good comment. The question is, how do we measure it, and can we come up with a metric that would actually be something distinguishable for the different portfolios? Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I see the acknowledgement there. So we'll certainly take note of that. So just to wrap up, and thanks for those comments, I think it kind of fits well here on slide 13, where we're wrapping up this introductory discussion. At the end of the day, the idea is to be able to pull this input together, pull the metrics together into an integrated scorecard where we can record what we think are the key measures to meet those objectives. And I'll emphasize here that the scorecard isn't intended to provide a single answer, to provide even a ranking across each of the portfolio strategies that we'll be looking at. So it's not a means to plug in all the numbers and out comes an answer that says portfolio 2 is the winner, but it's more a way of putting everything on paper so that you can see the trade-offs, so that you can see the measurements, see the metrics against the different portfolios. Different stakeholders, different members of the committee are likely to have different perspectives. They may weight certain objectives slightly differently than others, and there's no right answer as to what the right weighting is. Ultimately, there are some very key objectives that minimally have to be met, but in terms of other measurements, there may be different perspectives. And I think the idea at the end of the day is to just provide a tool where we can transparently look at the measures, transparently look at potential trade-offs, and ultimately guide decision-making. So instead of at the end of the analysis period, wondering how we're going to trade off these different results that we get, try to set some structure up front and say, once we do the analysis, we're going to put them into this scorecard framework and have it as a guide as we go forward and make recommendations or comments on the preferred portfolio. I do see another comment from Anita suggesting changing environmental sustainability to environmental resiliency, so we can take note of that. And I guess just to close out this session, just keep in mind what we just talked about for the discussion. I know we'll be going into an open roundtable discussion after we complete this presentation, but a couple questions here, and we've already, I think, gotten some comments and inputs. Have we considered an exhaustive list here of planning objectives, and what metrics and measures would the RAC find helpful? So again, we want to be exhaustive, but we want to be manageable and discrete and complete and specific. So as we go forward here and kind of shift gears through the remainder of the presentation, I know we would encourage the group to think about any input they have to answer these questions when we open the floor up later, and I'll just pause to see if there are any other comments before then. Question, will we be able to distinguish the added cost of the environmental goals? So yes, I think the questioner is getting to the point of potentially a trade-off between certain environmental metrics and certain affordability metrics. It's not necessarily always a clean line, but part of having the scorecard where we have environmental metrics, affordability metrics, other metrics, is to show what the impacts of different plans might be across all of them. So for example, there may be different costs associated with different levels of environmental resiliency or stewardship at different points in time. So the idea here is definitely to be able to evaluate how the different portfolio options that we'll be studying perform across multiple metrics and not just any single one in isolation.
Hi, Phyllis Viagran. Thank you for the presentation. I think when we talked about system reliability and resiliency, I think we need to take in the infrastructure of San Antonio. I think you're going to do some of that there, because we have areas of town with everything's underground, it's newer infrastructure, and then we have areas of town where everything's over their head. and it has to be because of the land and stuff. So I think we need to take into consideration the infrastructure. The other thing in terms of affordability, when you talk about the average resident bill impact, are y'all going to look at, right now CPS has the option of coming to city council for a rate increase? Let's pretend they can't, or they get no's every time they come to city council for a rate increase. Are we going to, can we plan for that also in this scenario?
Yeah, that's a fair comment. I think ultimate rate making impacts are a little bit outside of what we're doing here. I mean, we can consider that, but the core analysis framework is really, if we were to implement this plan, this is what it would cost. And somehow that cost has to be recovered in rates. Now, the structure, the timing of that could certainly vary. So I take your point there, but I think from an analysis framework, we have to just focus on, if we were to implement XYZ plan, these would be the costs and these are the potential trade-offs.
Okay, thank you. And then I just wanted to echo what Anita had to say about the environmental piece, the resiliency, and maybe, I don't know if the committee or CPS or CAC wants to actually break down those real measures for the climate action and adaptation plans, because there's a lot there and they could cost a great amount of money. And I think I'm excited about what's going to come, but I just don't know if this is, I'm nervous that if the residents as a whole of the city of San Antonio are going to be, I don't want to do this work and then the residents are like, this doesn't work for us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
I just wanted to be mindful of time, so you have till 4:15, and if there's questions right now, that's fine, but I want to be sure that we do have enough time for your full presentation, and then we do have extensive time afterwards for discussion as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Cantu. So we have about 30 minutes of content, so I'll just read the last comment here and then probably move on. In light of the RMA report stating that CPS Energy has misled the public on clean energy, how can the public trust this process in regards to the cost of renewables and shutting down spruce? So all I'll say here, and we'll open it up again later, the idea of this whole process is to be transparent and show you all the assumptions, show you the way that we're measuring things, and take the input throughout the process as we evaluate it. Again, happy to open up comments later, but in the interest of time, we'll move on.
Dee Dee, are you wanting the question now, or would you wait until the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do want to ask a question, and it kind of piggybacks on what Council Member Villagran said. I think she's very in tune with her residents and the concern over bill impact, and that like at the end of this process, what if they say this doesn't work for us? And if there is a rate increase, or there's a potential rate increase. And the reason, so my question is, to help Councilmember Villagran, on one of your slides, you'll talk about analysis and response to stakeholder feedback and requests. I've looked at resource planning processes in other cities. I could point to Austin, I could point to Sacramento, where the utilities have like robust stakeholder engagement, and that's not like this type of committee, a rate advisory committee, but like when community members can get input, they can ask questions, they can question data and analysis. I think that would probably help, like Councilmember Villagran, knowing that her residents can ask questions, not at the end of this process, but as we're developing a plan for spruce. So I'd like to know, like, what does that look like in other cities for y'all that you have done work in? Like, how do we bring in other people that are going to be affected by, when one not only affected by like pollution from this coal plant and the health impacts, environmental impacts, but also, you know, a possible bill impact from any decisions that are made here, not here, but with the board.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, very briefly, I think part of that can be facilitated through this process where we're seeking input on the metrics up front, and part of it will be facilitated by the next part of the agenda today, where the RAC will be looking to have an advisor work through some of those details. And then part of it is probably a broader community outreach question, which, you know, I'll defer to other experts within CPS to touch on. So appreciate that. I know we have a couple other slides that will summarize some of the feedback or input that the team has received already. And I know as part of the process, we are looking for support on all of those elements. So there may be different ways to do that. This is one forum, and there may be others that we can work through. But do want to emphasize that we are open to those inputs and comments. All right, so the next step here is to move into the developing ERCOT market perspectives. And we're going to start with some baseline market inputs and then transition to the portfolio and scenario comments in the latter part of the remaining 25 minutes that we have. So at 4, okay. All right, so very quickly, the modeling process here won't get into details, but we've got an Aurora tool that simulates the market from an ERCOT perspective and from a CPS portfolio perspective. So we take a whole series of inputs, simulate the ERCOT market, take those outputs and simulate the CPS Energy system. Those inputs here, we've provided an appendix here that have a lot more detail, but ultimately we're looking at demand growth, market rules, fuel prices, carbon regulation, new plant generation costs, and all this data will be available and as part of the process that we'll go into for both the baseline and the various scenarios. So before we get into those scenarios, I just want to give a very quick overview of the portfolio concepts. These portfolios are CPS Energy plans to meet customer requirements in the future, and a combination of decisions could include retirements, energy efficiency, and new resource options. I mentioned the options that CPS Energy has outlined already, including various levels of renewables, natural gas, blend, and potential community input. For example, Public Citizen has requested the following portfolios be modeled, and this is the type of input that we're talking about that will be incorporated into this process. So this is one example where they've requested different dates on coal retirements, different opportunities to look at coal to gas conversion, and a potential portfolio where all fossil fuel is retired over time. And there's different timelines the Public Citizen has offered up here to look at what those date options might look like and the type of new resources that can fill in. So with those type of comments, what we'll do here is provide a review of what the new resources might look like within those portfolios. And the Aurora tool that I referenced can take a lot of those inputs that we've talked about, can take a series of constraints, and can look at what the optimal mix from a cost and environmental constraint perspective is for the CPS Energy portfolio. So that just provides a quick preview of what that portfolio development process looks like. So the last section that we have, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Knight for the last 5 minutes, is scenarios. So we introduced that at a high level before. These are future states of the world independent of CPS Energy resource decisions. They reflect diverse but possible outcomes, and they entail a whole series of different uncertainties that we want to integrate together. So to preview what those look like, I'll invite Knight up here to provide a little bit more detail on what we're contemplating, and again, to solicit any comments or input here.
Thank you, Pat. So, no, as Pat said, scenarios are factors that are independent of CPS Energy resource decisions. And as we think about future states of the world, we consider 5 key uncertainties, including first, commodity prices; second, future carbon policy; third, the rate of change in technology costs in the future; fourth, demand growth; and five, future potential changes to the ERCOT market design. And these 5 key uncertainties are quite common across other integrated resource planning work that we have done for other utilities. Now, at a high level, we are proposing at this point in time 4 scenarios, but as we have been emphasizing, we are happy to get your feedback in informing the final scenario design. The first one is the reference scenario, where essentially we are assuming a continuation of historical trends in demand growth, as well as consensus view on technological developments. The second one is carbon-based economy, and this is a permutation of the reference scenario where we explore the world where environmental regulation have been reduced and where there are no limits, either at federal or state level, on carbon emissions. The third scenario is, in a way, a polar opposite of the second one, where here we look at a future of the world, a future state of the world where there are a federal or state level economy-wide net zero carbon targets by 2045, and the implication of that on the system. And finally, a fourth, volatile market scenario, and here is essentially looking at what's been going on in the world right now and projected forward into the future. And it's a world where geopolitical concerns drive policy decision making across environmental and energy fields. So just going a bit deeper, and given the time, here we are showing proposed combination of uncertainties for each scenario. And so in this table, in the vertical axis, we are showing different scenarios. And on the horizontal axis, we are showing the 5 key uncertainties. Starting with the reference scenario, and as I said, here we are essentially assuming baseline or consensus view across all the uncertainties. As we move toward a carbon-based economy, we are proposing to modify the commodity price assumption to be lower than in the reference scenario, based on the notion that reduced environmental regulations would lead to faster improvement in, or rather lower cost of resource extraction, and leading to lower gas prices. And as a result of that, demand for electricity would also be higher than the reference scenario. In the net zero carbon economy, here we assume a coherent policy framework where there's a push to drive electrification in buildings. And as a result of that, there's a reduction in gas demand, leading to lower commodity prices. And to support the electrification drive, there will be a high carbon price and a policy to support research and development of new and emerging technologies, causing fast decline in technology costs. And as a consequence of that, you get high demand driven by electrification. And given the change in the ERCOT market, there could be capacity market and seasonal reserve margin constraint. Lastly, in the volatile market scenario, here the narrative being that because of all the trade restrictions, there will be high commodity prices, and the resulting inflation caused a policymaker to decide against adopting carbon pricing to alleviate inflation pressure. Trade restrictions would then lead to slower decline in technology costs, and demand would be lower here due to high energy prices. So those are, as I said, our proposal for the scenario modeling, and we'll be happy to get your feedback in the other part of this meeting. So last slide now. In the next steps, we will continue to collaborate with the RAC and other stakeholders, getting your feedback and inputs, and incorporate that into our analysis. We will be finalizing the scorecard based on the inputs we have been receiving today. And as I said, we are still at the proposal stage for scenario design and portfolio concepts. And so any thought would be appreciated, and we will continue to work on that, and we will have more results to share with you in the future. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just a little to inform the RAC, a little change in time. We do have 2 public comments, so I want to be able to give them time. We scheduled them at 4:30. So we'll have at least the next half hour for some discussion. And I do want to start out with Dee Dee. I want to be sure your question was thoroughly addressed. Dee Dee, you want to say anything else?
Part of my question was like, what does stakeholder engagement look like in other utilities that CRA has worked with in doing resource planning? So that CPS Energy could know, because I mean, community members have made recommendations on what like a public planning process looks like that's been ignored for years. So it'd be, I'd like to hear from you all, like, what do you all do with in other cities, other utilities that you're working with?
Yeah, sure. I think the core process that we have is to hold public meetings like this and present information and get feedback. Jurisdictions handle things different ways. Some cities have public processes. Some states have mandated IRP processes with a public stakeholder comment period. And in general, what we found successful is to present information in forums like this and solicit specific questions for feedback. So for example, the key objectives that we talked about today is one area where we tend to get a lot of feedback. Scenario design is another. Portfolio construction is another. Process-wise, I think we found it effective to do it in public settings and then set up channels of communication and solicit email input, solicit public comments, and give an opportunity both for those comments to come in writing at various stages in the process. Obviously, there's a set of constraints on how much of that input can be actionable in any process, but that's a practice that we've seen in many different jurisdictions, facilitated through these type of engagement processes, and then in electronic communication that can happen. Like I said, there's other areas of community outreach that I know CPS is looking at, and maybe I'll let John chime in if he's got any other general comments there.
In regards to any
Soliciting feedback.
Okay, I'll defer. I think our CEO is going to make a few comments here.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, our consultants that are here presenting today are going to run the models that we utilize the RAC to help us, provide, the right inputs for whatever number of scenarios that we decide will be robust enough for community dialogue. They're not, here to determine how we engage the community, the board, and our leadership team. That's our responsibility. The RAC has been set up to primarily do that. We'll also use the CAC, but we will have a fairly robust open house and public meeting, probably in the fall, September, October timeframe when this work wraps up, so that the community can come in and talk to us about it. But, Charles Rivers Associates is not, here to really, tell us how to engage the public. That's my job as a CEO, taking direction from the board, and that's how we'll proceed. So I just, Dee Dee, I've had this conversation, this is the process that our board has directed us to utilize for public input into the generation plan that they ultimately will decide upon. That what is presented to the board ultimately will include a financial model that tells us whether or not, our proposal is going to drive rate cases in the future or whatever that looks like going forward on the financial side. So that's kind of the process. We need to get this modeling done with the RAC's input. Then we'll have, some public dialogue outside of the RAC, and then ultimately the board will make some decisions, at the end of the year. So that's where we're headed here. But it's our job, as CPS Energy with the board's direction to engage the public appropriately.
All right, thank you, Rudy. We have a follow-on question from Femi. Go ahead, Femi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks for the presentations. I think this gives a good overview of how CPS Energy is engaging with Charles River. The follow-on question is to what Rudy just said. This is a very critical piece of the process in that we're talking about the board giving directions. We as members of the RAC haven't been appointed in part by members of the board. I guess I'm curious to know in terms of timeline, at what points will the board be engaged either directly or through us? And just give me, I'd like to know, have a sense of the timeline for all these activities. This is something that could drag into months, practically, just given my experience with modeling and what I'm assuming would be how many of those scenarios, etc., will be addressed. So I'm trying to find out, really, to get a sense of the timeline, how the board will be engaged, and how much of that direction will be made clearly known to us to know the limitations of our inputs and if there are any limits that may be imposed by the board. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Femi. Just a clarification, are you referring to RAC and board interaction specifically?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Cantu, can you take that one?
We had that slide with the timeline, if you're able to get that back up. So my understanding is that, see if we can get that timeline back up. November.
And my apologies if I missed the timeline. I came in a bit late. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. It's one more. I think it's the one that we started with. Yes. So November would be the timeline to get to the board. So we wanted this timeline to be able for all the RAC to understand where we're at. So from here, and that'll be the discussion after the public comment about where we're going, we need to be able, the RAC will need to be able to develop questions that will go to the applicants for review. That way, August, it goes to the board who has to prepare this for November. So we're on a fairly tight time frame. So that's why we wanted to have this up for sure. So as you see, the RAC CAC input to the board is November of this year.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
No, just a follow-up question. Did you have a follow-up?
Yes, I'm, and again, it's more of me laying down what might be at least expectations just based on our past experiences with the board, with the RAC, and all the previous engagements we've had, even on this committee. The board meets once a month, roughly. And at certain points, I'm trying to see how much of that,
right,
how much opportunity we would have to get a feel for what the board is thinking, so that there are no miscommunications. I mean, there are many stakeholders involved here. Again, for the benefit of CRE, you probably know this already. There's a board, there's the city council, there's the municipal utilities committees, there's the CAC. They all have their timelines for meeting, and there has to be some type of coordination so that nothing gets missed, the ball doesn't get dropped somewhere, or something gets lost in translation, or even lost in timing between the times when these bodies meet.
Right.
So this may not be a direct question for CRA, but they should know and be aware of the fact that we have all these committees, the council, that have their own timelines for meeting. And, I just don't want a situation where something gets missing and misinterpreted because of timing.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Romero is here, so she can have some input into that question.
Thank you. Thanks, Femi. Just to go back to what Dr. Cantu said at the beginning, so I'm here to be the connection between RAC and the board, because I know it can be frustrating if you're having all these meetings, and then there's one point where you just say stuff to the Board of Trustees, and maybe doesn't seem like we're listening to all the work that you've done. So I'm here to absorb everything that's being said at every single meeting. And one of the things that Dr. Cantu mentioned at the beginning is that there will now be a report every month to the board that I'll present, which keeps them up to date on what you're doing along the way. And then in return, what we'd like to do, and I think Reed and I were going to talk about this next week, and Dr. Cantu, the board will be providing objectives to you for each meeting, not to tell you what you should be doing, but to say, these are some of the things the board would like to get from you, either as a final decision or at this meeting, like in August, at this meeting, this is where you make this decision leading up to your recommendations, so that we can have that continual two-way conversation and dialogue between the board and the RAC. But if there's other suggestions for how we can make that better, feel free to let me know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Dr. Romero. Before we go to, I see a question from Reed, but Peter had his hand up, so go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cantu, and thank you, Trustee Romero, for that, the role that you're playing. Really appreciate that. My question are based on, or to get some insight on the role of capacity savings, the capacity savings program in an integrated generation plan. As you should know, that we have had a 12-year run with what was called our STEP program, which provided over 900 megawatts of capacity savings. And we've just launched a new program. And I wanted to get your insight on, I understand we have a very robust way of addressing demand response with it even now. And right now with the heat as it is, it's been a very useful tool in that respect. But can you evaluate and/or rate our program against other utilities that you've worked with? Is ours exceptional? Is it average? Is it below average? How do you see the value of it factoring into a integrated generation plan or resource plan? And considering that we've heard it said here that it's considered a fifth fuel, some consider it a fifth fuel. I didn't hear anything about it in the presentation thus far, so I just wanted to get your feedback on that.
All right, I'll take a shot at to kind of set the stage there, Peter. Good question. You're speaking about our Sustainable Tomorrow Energy Plan, or STEP, and how that's factored in. And it's part of the load forecast, so it modifies the load. Today, we have, at least if you look at the demand response program alone and the controllable amount, that's a little over 200 megawatts. So we've been working on this for 13 years, and we've got a very large resource compared across the industry. I think it will rank pretty highly against other utilities. Now that represents 5% of our load or less, so or peak demand. So very good resource, but still a challenge and can play a role. Now it modifies the load. So we talked about the demand forecast and sensitivities and variability regarding climate. There's also some sensitivities and variability we can factor in regarding the STEP program. And we got to be just very methodical about that. So let me, given that, do you have any other comments you want to make regarding experience or some things we may consider regarding the energy efficiency demand response program?
Yeah, just very briefly. It's difficult to compare across utilities directly because there's different weather, there's different base of customers. Some utilities have very large industrial bases that have even larger programs. Some peak in the winter versus the summer. Some have more moderate conditions. So just to that question, I think to John's point, it's a very significant program, but difficult to rank it directly with other utilities. But all that said, it's envisioned as part of the load scenarios that I mentioned. And when we look at different portfolio options, there's certainly a way to measure the portfolio costs with and without those type of adjustments. So I think on the portfolio slide, we had a footnote where we could be evaluating the portfolio costs and performance with and without different levels of energy efficiency, either that program or something else. So it's certainly not something that will be ignored here.
So are you saying that you've not had that experience with another utility where you factored it into an integrated generation plan?
Oh, no. I was just indicating that from a direct comparison perspective, I didn't want to necessarily rank CPS against other utilities, given how profiles are very different. But demand-side resources, energy efficiency, demand-side management in general is definitely something that we deal a lot with different utilities. And to John's point, it's often looked at on the demand side. There are also different programs that you can evaluate from a supply side perspective. And like you said, consider it a fifth fuel or a resource type that effectively provides energy and capacity to the system at a certain cost and compare it to portfolios that don't have that program. So demand side management, definitely something that is part of this type of process that we've worked with many utilities.
Great. And just one last comment on that, and with the goal being to be able to validate the cost-benefit ratio of investing in that type of a program. And then, of course, with the affordability piece being that cross-pollination of customer affordability as well as the overall organizational benefit on cost. So those are my thoughts. That was my reason for why I think it's important to factor it in and see how a scenario could give us information to invest more and more effectively, specifically, because of the programs that are involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Any other questions here? We do have one. I'm sorry. Chris?
Two quick questions or comments. I would just like to point out on page 9, in the subtext, on initial options for CPS Energy portfolio, you're providing some guidance and an overview and a suggestion. And I just want to encourage us to all be careful about our use of language. I don't think this is what you intended, but when you make a reference to an optimal blend of natural gas and renewables, it sort of sounds conclusory, and as if that were the goal already determined at this point. And I certainly don't think you intend that, but considering we're also trying to make this as transparent and pro-public engagement as possible, I want to encourage us to try to avoid language that might suggest that conclusion's already foregone. And then along those lines, because the members of the RAC come from such a broad and diverse range of sectors, including public, private, nonprofit, academia, government, some of the terminology that we're throwing around has slightly different meanings in different sectors. And I didn't know if there might be an industry standard glossary you might be able to suggest that you tend to refer to, or that those in the industry refer to. So when we use terms like sustainability or resilience, we can try to not talk past each other so much and be sure we're all on the same page when we understand what those terms mean. Thank you.
All right, that's good feedback. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I'd like to just do a little bit more of a deep dive on Femi's question about timing, because I hear his concern. It does appear from the slide that we have a November timeline to try to make a recommendation to the board. So I guess my follow-on question is do we have a more detailed timeline of events that between CRA's research and the decision recommendation process of this body, do we have a timeline that we're following to make sure that we're not just rushed at the very end to get something to the board, but that we're sort of, pacing out our work, and because we do have a tight schedule between now and November.
Yeah, that's a good point, Michael. That's something that I believe we need to bring forth here pretty soon, like next meeting or after the break. You talking about the Iraq advisor or the timeline? Okay, got you. Okay.
We lost audio.
Reed had a couple of questions, but he said he could wait till after the public comments. Can we do public comments now?
Sure.
Okay, we do have 2 public comments, and the first one is Tabitha Bordiolo. And I'm not sure, is it in person or, oh, yes, she is. Yeah, right here. Oh, you've got the mic, okay.
All the way up to the podium?
Yeah, so he's on the camera.
Thank you so much for allowing public comments. Let me go ahead and pull mine up. Hi, I'm Tabitha Guardiola. I am here as the Climate Justice Coordinator for Southwest Workers Union. I live in District 2, and here's my public comment. Due to the extreme heat, I think an action of holding CPS accountable needs to be in order. There has been omitted truths about energy efficiency and its costs, and I support public citizens' suggestion to run multiple scenarios. I have a few requests on questions today in regard to the RMI report. And I saw that there was a comment about replacing spruce would be a cost burden to the community, and I was looking for some elaboration on that today. And I was wondering why there's a hesitation to take initiative to a sustainable development in energy such as renewable resources. Other cities, such as like Austin or Sacramento and other big cities have run these. I'm not sure about Austin actually, but I know that other major cities have run multiple scenarios to find data on cost options through different types of ways that renewable energy or partial supplementation of renewable energy. So with those, I'm sorry, I'm reading off a small document. With those scenarios run, they come up with cost plans, and so I was just wondering why we haven't considered this before. We're now experiencing this extreme heat. These are effects of climate change, and climate change has been happening for over a decade. Maybe it's been happening longer than that, but I'm just wondering why we haven't taken initiative sooner, and what is it going to take for, like, how much suffering from the community is it going to take for us to take the initiative? With San Antonio continuously growing in population due to the economic development, we should be considering these growing pains and changes, dealing alongside with climate change, causing these catastrophic weather events. It's your duty as a public utility to be held responsible for taking immediate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And second is Isabella Briseno.
Hello, I'm Isabella Briseno. I'm a District 3 resident, a ratepayer, and a teacher on the south side of San Antonio. I'm here today to talk about the RMI report and the need to not only hold CPS and their Board of Trustees accountable as a result of this information and subsequent misinformation or hiding of this information, but to take the facts within the report and commit to replacing spruce with a clean renewable energy source. Ratepayers are upset, but not shocked, that we've been lied to by CPS in regards to this report, and you all should be as well. Please do not continue to hold on to assumptions about energy efficiency programs and clean energy made based off of incorrect or manipulated data from our utility. The Board of Trustees, including and especially the mayor, are committed to businesses, not to their constituencies. It's upsetting that the STEP program was restructured without information from this report, especially now as temperatures remain in the triple digits and working San Antonians go without AC or adequately weatherized homes. Even those of us with these protections are still feeling the heat. I'm sure we all are. A future in which spruce is replaced by natural gas is a future in which the climate crisis and thus these extreme temperatures is exacerbated. The fact is that CPS presenting information that implies natural gas is an affordable option is not true. As markets shift, it's incredibly dangerous for them to not only make this assumption, but to pass it off to you as crucial decisions are being made by you. I am here imploring you to push CPS Energy to reflect on these findings of this report, if you have not already read it yourselves, hopefully you have, and to respond by giving adequate consideration and time to renewable energy, and to gather more honest information about natural gas before making decisions around generation planning. I also want to echo that I support Public Citizens' proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we do have 15 minutes before our break. Reed, are you in there? Are you there? So we can go ahead and address your questions.
Yes, I am here. Just a couple of questions. I'm not sure whether this is for, it's for maybe Charles River or CPS combined. So looking on, kind of on page 12, which is what I know y'all focused on a lot, and certainly we need to. And let's see. It's on the, let me bring mine up. I can talk about it better. So these are where you're looking at the potential metrics and the objectives. I think this is really important for us. I'm concerned in the affordability, or let's start system. I clearly understand how we do that, but I do think we also need to look at some utilization factors in there if we can. Affordability, I know we're focusing on looking at residential bills, but I wouldn't ignore the fact that we need to look at all the bills, because the residential bills has a couple of assumptions. You have to get the total revenue requirement, then you have to get the allocation to residential, and then you have to figure out how you're going to bill residential. So, and on top of that, since we are using the fuel adjustment to pass through contract charges, we've been doing that on renewables. We might start doing it with hydrocarbon generated. I need to understand better, not today, but at some point in time, I need to understand better how we're going to actually, or what metric we're going to use as that total cost in comparing the various assumptions. And also on, when you're back on the scenarios, there's a lot of talk about the cost curves for natural gas, and there's a lot of issues on obviously coal, but I'd particularly be interested in CPS and Charles River's opinion on where we are on pricing for not just those, but the renewables, particularly solar, and where they think the price curves are going on those. We've just bought some, and we need to understand those price factors as well. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you very much, Reed. No more feedback, Reed. We'll take a look at all that. There's some good suggestions, and again, this is all what we're showing here is notional suggestions. So
yeah,
that's good feedback, and we'll see how to incorporate that and what category it may go in and things like that. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'm out.
Okay. Other questions virtually or on the in-person? No? I think we're okay. So we're at 4:30. Let's go ahead and take a break till 4:45, and then we will get started again. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and get back together. We're at 4:45. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming back. And we are going to go to our next agenda item, which is qualification received for the RAC consultant. And I just want to be sure that everybody did get an email with the 5 applicants to the RFQs. And what we're going to be doing right now, or at least for the next hour, 15 minutes, is discussing how we're going to go forward with this. Hearing no one say they didn't get it, so I'm just going to go on. And I'm looking around and I'm looking at the, so we're okay. All right, so right now we have 5 applicants to the RFQ. Black and Vetch, Burns and McDonnell, Energy Strategies, Rocky Mountain, and Siemens. So the next item for us to determine is to determine if we want to narrow down the number of respondents being interviewed to 3, or if we prefer to do them all. And this would be something that we would need to accomplish at the August RAC, so our next meeting. So if we're thinking about the next meeting and whether we want to interview the 5, we also need to be considerate of the fact that there are 21 RAC members. And if we all want to be a part of that, that might present some challenges relative to time. And so with this in mind, before we get to the point of developing the questions, I want to put forward to the RAC committee for their thought and discussion as, do we want to select a smaller subcommittee of the RAC to be the committee that interviews the 5 candidates, make a recommendation, and then make that recommendation to the larger RAC in August? It would mean that if we do want a subcommittee to do that, it would be having an additional meeting earlier so that we can have our recommendations, or that subcommittee's recommendation, ready for August RAC. So that's one consideration to make. And I'd like some discussion on that. We could go with the whole 21 and have the 5 applicants come in August, and we would interview them, same amount of time, same questions, or we could do it where we have a subcommittee doing that work and then coming to the August, to the August full RAC with the recommendation. And what could be done also, if that subcommittee is tasked with asking those questions of the 5, it may be possible, if the full RAC wants to at least listen into that, and if they had the time and the time to do that, that would be possible as well. So open for discussion right now relative to that. So the option of a subcommittee, meeting earlier to do it, or just waiting for the full August committee meeting, and knowing that we will have all 5 here that we have to ask questions of, and then feedback with that. Might not be possible to do that in 3 hours. We may need, if that is a choice, we may need to think of a longer meeting where we start in the morning, have a lunch break, and then the afternoon as well. So, thoughts, discussion, comments?
Dr. Cantu, can I say something?
Of course, of course. Is this Dee Dee? I'm sorry, is this Dee Dee?
Yes, this is Dee Dee, I'm sorry. I'm just wondering, in the interest of time, to maybe we narrow it down, the list to three that we would actually speak to. Because, if we make a decision in August, that doesn't leave a lot of time between August and that decision month in December. I think a subcommittee would be good. It would help to like maybe do some of the homework that's necessary to research into these groups some more. But I'm not stuck to that. I'm open to what everybody else says. But I would wondering if we should narrow it down.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and thanks for reminding me that is an option too. From the 5, we could narrow it down to 3.
Yes, this is Jim Berg. I'm online.
Yes.
And let me put the video on. I would agree with Dee Dee, and I think that not only should it be narrowed down, but I do not think to 3, but I do not think that the committee of the whole should be interviewing 5 applicants. I think that's onerous and non-productive.
Okay.
And the legwork should be done by a smaller committee, and with recommendations then brought to the full committee, the full RAC, as to what perhaps 1, 2, and 3 ranking would be recommended by that smaller group. And I would say a group that could be an odd number, so that 5 or 7 members can come back, 3, 5, or 7 members can come back with recommendations for the full committee, full RAC.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Berg. Other comments? Peter?
Yes, I also agree with the subcommittee, and I concur with Mr. Berg and Dee Dee as well.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Any other comments relative to forming a subcommittee? Oh, I'm sorry. Anita, was that you?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No problem. Go ahead.
And also I wanted to say, I didn't get an opportunity because I wasn't here last month, but congratulations, Dr. Kintu, on being vice chair.
Thank you.
What I wanted to say is I do like the idea of having, the subcommittee do kind of the deeper dive and kind of give their thoughts. My question is, I don't know, in order to pick 3 of the 5, somebody has to evaluate on some level to pick 3 out of 5. And I know 5 is a lot, but I just don't, how would we pick the 3? And what about the other 2? And then if the other 2 get picked, we haven't spoken to them. So I kind of feel like maybe the subcommittee could do the deeper dive into all 5 and then come back with a recommendation. And, I would be open to maybe knowing the top 3 at that point or not. But I feel like I have a hard time weeding out 2 of them, basically.
Thank you, Anita. And we do not have a defined criteria for narrowing it down to 3. So it could be that the recommendation that would have to do the 5, because we have not decided on that. And next one. Yes, we have.
Yes, ma'am. I'd also be concerned about how the subcommittee is going to be selected, because I've listened to some of these meetings and people have asked, well, how come you don't have this group on here? You don't have that group. And so I have a little concern about taking it down to a small committee, being that I've heard some of the comments of people, how come you don't have this person, that person? So I don't know what their motives are, but I would be concerned about how we're going to pick this smaller committee.
Okay, thank you. And I'm looking, I see the comment on the chat box from Mr. Rodriguez. I would be in support of a subcommittee, but I would like to have the option to take a back seat or witness of those subcommittee meetings. The subcommittee first task would be to choose the 3 to 5. Okay, we have another comment here.
Yeah, along with what you were just saying, Wayne, I think that, first of all, the subcommittee would come back with a ranked recommendation for vote of the full committee. And like was suggested up here and suggested earlier, if it was somehow broadcast, on Zoom or whatever, other people could still listen in on all that. So it wouldn't necessarily exclude the rest of the RAC. It's not that that subcommittee would necessarily be doing it all in secret, but they would be the ones there asking more of the questions. But it would certainly be in public view, I would hope, of the rest of the RACs if they chose to tune into that. Also along these lines, I would also be, besides in favor of a subcommittee, definitely I'm in favor of narrowing it down to 3. I guess the real question is, how do we do that in a rapid manner? In my mind, I read them all, and it was, to me, I had 3 obvious that I would pick, but somebody else may disagree with me. But so we'd need to figure out how we time that to do that in a timely manner.
Okay. Councilwoman, have you got it? Yeah.
Yeah, I would be in favor for a subcommittee. I also agree with those that in the comments that are saying that it would be the subcommittee to decide from 3 to 5. So if people want to volunteer and be part of that subcommittee, I think we should take volunteers for that subcommittee. The other thing is I like the idea of being able to watch or view if it's done via Zoom as a committee member to kind of just see if there was somebody that one of the 5 or the 3 that we had questions or concerns about. But I'm in favor of a subcommittee looking at that and then them looking at the 5 proposals and then deciding what the 3 would be.
Okay. Thank you, Councilwoman. I thought I saw Mr. Sanchez. I agree with Anita and would like to evaluate the 5 proposals. I also agree with using a smaller committee to evaluate and interview the bidders. Femi, I see you have a comment.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I agree with the need to go from 5 to 3 to 1. Again, on timeline, we are expecting to have this decision made by August. Is that still this?
That's
That's still the, okay.
Yes.
So that means at some point, and of course, the committee meetings will not be public meetings, and just thinking back to the experience we had with the modeling subcommittee that we had, or the modeling working group, we should be prepared to have a number of meetings, I guess, off cycle, a few times before the August meeting. Just again, thinking in terms of timing.
Okay.
So I'm just going to say this, that we need to pick those. I would suggest, just in the interest of time and really to move quickly, to have the subcommittee done today. Let's know who are on that subcommittee and probably discuss what those criteria would be, to the extent that they can be discussed in a public setting as we have today. It'll be nice to get those, not only the members of the subcommittee, but the criteria agreed upon by the larger and the full RAC committee as present at today's meeting. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. And I have Mr. Sanchez. Michael Sanchez is volunteering to be on the committee. I think I would just say between Reed, if you're still on, and myself, I think one of us should be on the committee. That would be and then Mr. Sanchez, Reed or myself was 2. 7, I heard 5 or 7, 1 being an odd number. Since we are a committee of 21, 7 seems to be a good number. Dee Dee would also like to be on the committee, so that's 3. Peter, Chris, and Michael. Okay. How many is that, Ann? We've got 6 with anyone else, so we can make it 7.
I saw where Jim Berg wants to be on it.
Okay, thank you. I didn't see that. Jim Berg, so that's 7. Anthony, Sorry, I didn't see you, Mr. Edwards. You would like to be on the committee as well? Or were you wanting a question? Oh, you're on mute. Mr. Edwards, you're on mute. Still on mute. Or if you want to put your comment in the chat. Okay, so if we add Femi and Mr. Edwards, are you wanting to be on the committee? Yes? He got thumbs up, so okay, so that would be 9. I think we can stop there, Ann? Yes, and that, because that's an odd number, so we're at that. And then what we will need to do is talk about time frame with the smaller subcommittee. All right, so I think we've got that one agenda item complete. The subcommittee will also be tasked with narrowing it down from 5 to 3, and then to 1. That will come to the August RAC for their recommendation and approval. Did I miss anything? Let's see. Oh, I didn't see any comment there. Okay. Now, the remainder of the time today will be for us to decide on the questions that we would want to ask each applicant for the subcommittee. And those questions do need to be the same for each one. There's no necessarily a number, a set number of how many questions, but just that we develop questions today with all RAC input that the subcommittee then will ask each of the applicants to narrow it down to 3 and then to narrow it down to the 1. All right? So, Femi, there's a comment, please. Yes.
Yes. First of all, I think you had 9 members. So if I came in late, you can take my name off and just come down to 7.
No, I think you're on there.
You want 7.
You're on there with the 9, so we're okay. We still have an odd number of.
Okay. I thought you wanted to limit it to 7. In any case, I'll go ahead with that.
9 will be fine. All right.
Now, as for the questions, again, one of the things that we are trying to do is to ensure that the interviews will be held in a non-public setting. I don't know whether this is a good forum to start discussing those questions, because that essentially gives away the exam sheet or the exam questions. I don't know if that's the way to go. It's just that it feels I feel uncomfortable with doing that. I don't know if any other member feels that way. But if there's a certain point at which I think we need to move into a quote unquote an executive type session away from the public, because of course these members or these interviewees, so to speak, might be listening.
Sure, got it. Good point. Thank you for bringing it up. And I think we're going to get some expert advice on this. Dr. Romero, or?
Yeah, can I speak for a minute?
Wait, just a second, Rita. The issue was about the public. Do we want to do it now when we're open to the public?
I think a question to ask is if you are going to provide the questions in advance to the firms that will be interviewed, then I think there's no problem in talking about the questions in a public forum. But if you weren't going to do that, then it's possibly a concern. So maybe that's a question y'all need to decide first.
Will we be providing the questions to the applicants previous to them being interviewed? And if so, then we are okay with doing that. Or doing it now in terms of getting the questions done in a public forum. Reed, you had a comment.
Excuse me, Dr. Cantu. From our earlier discussions, I thought we were headed in the direction of everything being open to the public. We're all open to the public, and I also thought, and maybe wrong, that we were going to, I would hope that this committee receives some type of presentation from each one of the groups. And if we're going on the premise that we're going to take it from 5 to 3, and then down to 1, is that where it stands right now, Dr. Cantu?
Yes.
But I think the questions ought to be available to them ahead of time for efficiency, and I think it should be open to the public. Just
Okay.
my comments, but
Thank you, Reed. We do have
this is something I think you're doing a good job and you can handle, but I would really worry about having private meetings.
okay, we have a comment from CPS.
My name is Lisa Lewis. I don't know that I've met most of you. I have responsibility for supply chain. Since this is a CPS Energy procurement, it should follow our standardized process. What I would recommend that you do is come up with the criteria by which you intend to rate or evaluate these. And it would be good for all of you to have that opportunity to weigh in on those criteria. If it's experience, if it's level of expertise in certain fields, whatever that criteria is that is most important to you, I would start there. And then define your questions from that point. You can give them the questions in advance or not give them to them in advance. That's your choice. I do think that if you're going to make it public, you have to realize that it may be possible that some of the participants may not wish to do a public interview in that setting. It also creates the challenge of whoever went first and versus who went last, et cetera, gets some insight. So something to think about. I do think that it makes sense that you would have it available to yourselves, but you may not want to do that to the public. And if that's the decision you make, I would definitely want to inform the participants who've said they're interested to confirm that they still would be willing to participate in the event that the interviews were in public. So that just some guidance there, if that
Thank
helps.
you very much. Okay, I think with that comment from Reed, that's one other thing to discuss is public or private. Other than the comments that have already been made, and thank you for the CPS input, any other comments relative to public or private for the whole process? Councilwoman?
Yeah, I think my concern is that we'll lose some of the 5 if we make it public, which then could put us in a situation where we have to choose just one. So I'm for leaving it available for maybe the RAC committee and then bringing the one choice up on that August meeting for a public meeting to ask the questions that we had. And I'm for the conversation of that publicly right now at this meeting, we let people know what our priorities are in our asks. And then if the committee wants to form the questions or we want to send specific questions for the interview process, we can. But I feel like we should have put on when we first initially put it out there that this would be public.
Okay.
Thank you.
For fear of losing all the 5.
Yeah, because
Okay.
then I think some people would have said passed.
Okay. All right.
Comment.
Okay, just an acknowledgement of Mr. Rodriguez. I do agree with Ms. Lewis that we followed the purchasing plan. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that also. Instead of going through a pre-process and another process, get the 5 questions, whatever they are, submit them, let the people provide it in writing. That way you can put it out to all the members, you can look at it, and when you come to the meeting, you're informed on how all 5 of them are, you can vote.
Okay, thank you. All right, so then what I'm hearing so far is we do have a subcommittee. We have a subcommittee of 9 individuals. We are going to need to get a time for that committee to meet, probably within the next week. And that could be, of course, virtual. Looking at anywhere, the 7 a.m. start time to going up until 6 p.m. Maybe start with an hour, 2 hours to develop a timeline for the subcommittee. Now, another thing to discuss is the criteria, do you want the subcommittee to develop the questions? Or do we need to have all RAC input into it? And we can have that now. We do have certainly time. And I think we can have all of those documented to include for the subcommittee as they consider the 5. Anybody have any input into that? Go ahead. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, again, just thinking out loud here, I'm thinking that the subcommittee probably ought to work on those questions. I'm not sure, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm not sure anyone came here prepared to put together questions to pass on to to these bidders.
That's fair. Councilwoman?
Yeah, I would just, experience is going to be something that is important to me, but I don't have questions prepared. The other question I have is, do we need to make any motions now, or are we going to wait till conversation is over? That we created this committee.
Have we followed Robert's rules in the past that this needs to be a motion?
No, wasn't sure.
No. I don't know. I have not, in my experience with this, we haven't done any type of motion through Robert's rules, okay? So, all right.
I agree with what Michael is for.
Okay, thank you.
How he was talking about handling. You got a subcommittee, let them come up with the questions. You can always submit it out to everybody and they can add comments to it. But going back and forth, it's going to take way too much time. Let the committee do it.
Okay.
And my opinion is send it out to everyone with a deadline, and that way we can get comments from everyone, and then people can look at it. The committee still can come up with their recommendations, but at least everyone will have all the information.
Okay.
So it gets away from who's going to be the best speaker and who's going to do this and that and so on. You can see the criteria in writing.
Okay. Question for CPS, because I think, this is something that had come up before. Would the 5 applicants, and this goes to the purchasing policy, were they told at the time they submitted that they were all going to be coming in to the August RAC? Could we put where they meet with us earlier? That's a question. Are we okay with that?
They could meet with you earlier. We would just want to contact them and facilitate that on your behalf. They also were not told that they were all going to make it to the end.
Okay.
We didn't know how many we would have to begin with.
Okay.
So if you'd had 15, I don't think you would have wanted to interview all 15.
So we're okay with that. Okay. Was there anything else, Lisa, that you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So I think we have a subcommittee. We have 9 members of that subcommittee. We will be in touch to find a time as quickly as possible to have a beginning meeting to discuss the 5 applicants and then the criteria, then send that criteria out to the larger RAC for their comments, and then go forward with the interviews of the subcommittee. Did I capture everything? Is anything missing? And did you have anything?
The only thing, if we could pick the time, I think, for the first subcommittee meeting today, that would be great. And then that way everybody could start to plan on it accordingly.
All right. So we're looking at July 21st today. Is Tuesday or Wednesday of next week open, 9 a.m. for the people that are the 9 people? Tuesday, 9 a.m.? And we could go for 2 hours of virtual. If we need, and then we need more time, we can decide on date and time after that. Tuesday morning doesn't work for Dee Dee, okay? Dee Dee, does Wednesday morning work better?
Yes, thank you.
Wednesday morning for the 9? Okay, so it's going to be Wednesday morning at 9, and Ann, I'll leave it to you to connect with everyone, send them a link to the virtual WebEx, and
Bam.
I think we're okay. All right, good job, I think. Did I miss anything in the summary of it? All right, we're at 5:15. Do you think that Elvis can leave the building? What do you think? Yes? I just saw, my husband and I just saw that movie. It's a great movie. Christopher, I'm sorry.
Just for reference, Are there any other decision points that we need to be keeping in mind for the August meeting, separate from this conversation?
Or you mean if there's any other agenda item for August? Not that I'm aware of at this point. No. No, we're okay with that. Yes, ma'am.
So along those lines, and again, I'm just thinking out loud a little bit here. I know in this process of things going back to the objectives, I'd hate to wait too long to have input as to really defining those 6 objectives and ranking those 6 objectives. I think on the surface they all looked good, but certainly some are more important than others, and I'd hate to wait a month to either have input or maybe at least some feedback from CRA as to how they think they're prioritizing and how they define those objectives. I'd hate to wait a month on that.
So would it be, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but
Same here.
like if you have some thoughts right now that you want the subcommittee to consider, to go ahead and send those comments to Ann so that she can send them to the subcommittee at the first meeting so those can be taken into consideration. Just a thought, but would that kind of meet what you're asking?
Well, it's not necessarily questions to this other contractor.
Okay.
That's going to support us. It's really going back to Charles Rivers Associate and how they're conducting their process, and their first step in their process had to do with objectives.
Okay, I see what you're
And
saying.
if they're defining that on their own, it would at least be nice if there was some sort of intermediate feedback, whether it's something in writing. In other words, those all sounded good, but as far as things like, I happen to think system reliability and resilience has to be our number one, and not just sort of factored in as to one of these 6 things. I think it's absolutely number one. But in addition to it being ranked number one, we need to define what that really means to some level, not down to the, to the hair, but there's certain things that it can mean.
Okay.
So it'd be nice to get, at least maybe from them, what they see as reliability and resilience as far as this task. For example, Councilwoman, you mentioned some things about overhead and underground, and I totally agree with what you're saying, and I have concerns, but in the context of this particular task, I don't think that's relevant. That has to do with our distribution system and reliability at that level, but this task is more generation planning. And I don't think that is something that needs to be in here for that reason, for this particular task. Again, I have similar concerns that you have, but that's a separate task. So it'd be nice to get back from CRA as to how they define, and that's just one example here. It'd be nice to know how they're defining these objectives.
Go ahead.
Yep, we agree completely. What we need to do is get feedback from them, as you said, then we need to get feedback from you all. We've got to get the objectives nailed, and we also have to start talking about the scorecard that we want to use. We've suggested some things in the package, but we're really looking to you all to help sort out that scorecard and give us that insight on assigning value to each of those areas. So we're going to need to do both of those. What we could possibly do is have a conversation on Monday and plan maybe an intermediate call with the group. I want to see where you and Reed want to go, how you want to handle this. I don't want to jump too far into your business, but we do need to.
That certainly is an option, and Reed and I can certainly discuss that because that might be able to answer that question and give you more feedback, which is reasonable. I mean, what are the objectives? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just voicing the concern that we can't wait a month to get some of these things resolved.
No,
we can't.
Time is urgent here because we only have realistically 3.5 months to get to the end. And if we have to wait a month to get to step 1 of 6, we're already behind the schedule.
Right, and we've got the scenarios, and Dee Dee had suggested that really it's going to be a group discussion to maybe take the information she provided, the stuff we provided to start with, and firm those up into perhaps 10 scenarios. I think that was your right number, wasn't it, Dee Dee?
5 with a lot of details. But yeah, that's about right.
Okay, good. Well, anyway, that was where you all were going to come together and work on those and decide what made sense to you. And so we've got to facilitate that as well to get CRA moving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I just wanted to share one more thing. I like the idea, and what my plan was to do was to kind of look at the priorities CRA did and kind of give kind of an idea of what we want to focus. Because I think system reliability and resiliency is number one. But in connection to that system flexibility, what are they going to bring forward to us that is not flexible? And if it's, let's go solar, let's go thermal, but there's no flexibility. Like, these are just the questions I have as we look at that generational planning. And then the infrastructure, which I mentioned, is like a whole other thing when we look towards the future and how we bring in the step plan that we just passed for this. So I'm willing to look and kind of get more specific on that so that the committee has that, that the RAC committee as a whole, and that we all kind of can work off of each other in terms of how specific and what we want to prioritize. But like you, system reliability and resiliency is number one. Affordability would be number two.
Thank you. Okay, Christopher?
One final comment. I'm thinking back on the public comments that we heard today and questions of accountability and transparency. And if I'm hearing everyone correctly, what I'm hearing today is that we're creating the subcommittee so we can have these private discussions to allow for frank conversation and potentially the discussion of proprietary information from some of the presenters. Keeping in mind, though, the public comment section, I'm wondering if maybe the supply chain procurement office or Office of Legal Counsel could offer us some written guidance that we could read beforehand and inwardly digest to guide us through this process. So at least we're keeping these things in mind of certain principles to keep us focused on or areas we should avoid conversation on.
You're talking about the subcommittee, discussions in the subcommittee.
Yes.
Okay. I would think that CPS can supply those guidelines for us ahead of time. Thank you. Thank you very much. We do have a comment from Mr. Edwards to identify the subcommittee, and I have the list of Michael Sanchez, Reed or myself, Dee Dee, and Peter, Christopher, Michael, is this Michael?
Michael.
Oh, okay.
No.
We got the two Michaels. And then Mr. Jim Berg, Tony Edwards, Phoebe, and we are a meeting Wednesday at 9 a.m. It'll be virtual. Certainly will be open to any RAC members that might want to check in as well. But right now we're saying 9 to 11 and go forward after that. All right. Any other comments? I'm looking at the chat box. Nothing else? Nothing else from here? And if not, I wish everybody a good afternoon and good evening. Thank you all for your attendance today.